on the philanthropy side, and we have Dr. Ashok Menon, who is part of SABIC, which is one of the largest plastic producing company, right? We're talking about. So we have a very interesting panel, and we have done this report on the plastic recycling, right? So before we go deep dive, I think I will come to Amit, and just for the audience sake, I think you all know anyway. So audience sake, what is chemical recycling? Like when we talk of plastic recycling, probably one word on mechanical recycling and five words on 5 lines of chemical recycling, right? Just so that we know.
So diving right in. So essentially the incumbent and so to say the dominant methodology of recycling today is what is called mechanical recycling, which essentially is you take the commingled plastics. Typically, it works best with single streams, like for example, PET bottles or rigid HDPE, and you do the segregation and of material, individual materials. So you get all of your PET bottles, for example, separately out. You go through multiple washes, and eventually you would then extrude them and you would chop them into small pellets or recyclings, which then can go for various downstream applications. And it's a very large industry. It's more than 50 billion USD globally, and it's the dominant method. The challenge has only been that it works very well with certain kind of cleaner streams, but not so very well with municipal streams or post-consumer waste streams. And as all of us know, that most of plastics that are actually landing up are in the landfills or in the environment actually are coming from post-consumer or homes and such collection systems. So mechanical recycling essentially is washing, extruding, chopping down recyclates which are of inferior quality to virgin plastic, and so therefore they will go into some kind of a lower end downcycled application. There are of course exceptions. This is generally true but not always. For example, there is something called bottle-to-bottle recycling. Now coming, so it happens at an article level. So now, to what Shailesh was asked, is what is chemical recycling? So chemical recycling in some ways is like a new kid on the block. It's an emerging technology. The first few plants are coming up in different parts of the world. What it does is that as plastics are coming from crude oil, where you take molecules from the crude oil and then you constitute them to make these materials that we call plastics. Chemical recycling is operating at a molecular level where it takes back and deconstructs those molecules. And you get then smaller molecules, which are called oligomers or some kind of small hydrocarbons, which if they go back to the point of origin where plastics are manufactured, companies like SABIC, petrochemical majors, like in India, it could be a Reliance or an IOCL or there's so many other companies. They can take those liquid hydrocarbons, they can take those molecules which we've derived now from solid plastics, and they could reconstitute or make new plastics from it, which are actually virgin plastics. So they will say in some ways you're deconstructing the molecule, you're giving it back to the petrochemical, and they will reconstitute it into making new polymers, but a whole lot of renewable chemicals, sustainable aviation fuels, many pathways open up. So that essentially is the promise of chemical recycling, that it can take materials that mechanical recycling struggles with.
So essentially, you can use chemical recycling to create almost virgin plastic, right?
It will be identical, physical chemical identical.
So also just give 1 minute of intro, right, for the audience sake.
So I'm Amit and I'm founder at a company called Polycycle. Polycycle is a company, it's an R&D centric company in the field of chemical recycling, where we have been developing multiple solutions that take a stab at these hard to recycle or what are called non-recyclable or low-grade plastics, including, for example, single-use plastics, and to convert them into different kinds of products so that we find new ways in which these molecules can be reused. The company's R&D center is based in Chandigarh, which we are a team of engineers and scientists working on this problem for more than 10 years at this stage.
Thank you, Amit. I will come to Dr. Ashok now. So what is your view on the subject? Like, I think I heard somewhere that out of 4 barrels of oil, probably 1 or 2 barrels go just plastic production, right? They do not go to fuel. So a lot of time you think when we talk about fuel production, we think everything's going for the fuel, but probably out of 30% or 40% goes into only plastic, right? So companies like Stanley, I think it's around $50 billion currency, right? It's a huge thing. So how you see that recycling? And also before that, I'll just give 1 minute or 2 for the audience.
Sure. Good afternoon to all, and first, thanks for having Sadiq here. So my name is Ashok Menon. I lead the technology center for SABIC in Bangalore. SABIC is a global organization which primarily makes polymers, chemicals, and agri-nutrients, and it has a global footprint. So coming back to your question on recycling, right? So any chemical industry, and same is the case with SABIC, especially with SABIC, sustainability is at the core of our actions. We believe in sustainability. We look at our materiality, and from where we are driving strategies, sustainability becomes a core out of it. Now, within sustainability, if you look at it, we have three main pillars driving decarbonization. Being a chemical industry, it is carbon intensive. So our the key goal is how do you look at reducing the carbon intensity or driving decarbonization. Being in chemicals, you need to have chemical of concerns are the growing area that we need to address. So safer chemistry becomes another pillar. So decarbonization is one pillar, safer chemistry is another pillar. We heard about the plastic issues, the waste problems that we are looking at. So we strongly believe that we need to be part of this and look at how do you bring plastic back to the value chain. This is where recycling comes into picture. Then overall looking at how are we driving this into ESG performance and eventually reporting. Now talking about recycling, we have actually driven what we call as a program called True Circle. This True Circles have five pillars in it. One is mechanical recycling, which Amit did explain. You have these polymers you take back and subject them to mechanical recycling. Second, looking at chemical recycling, right? Hard to recycle products, mechanical recycling, there are mixed plastic waste. It's very difficult to look at mechanical recycling. In those cases, we try to look at plastic recycling exactly like what Amit mentioned, take it back into the value chain, put it back into the crackers to start making virgin polymers. It's as good as virgin polymers that you get. Third one that we look at is bio-based. When I say bio-based, you have used cooking oil, you have paper and pulp industry waste. These are also natural pyrolysis oil kind of chemicals that you can derive from and introduce into your cracker to make plastics. These are low carbon footprint. So now you are combining recycling with decarbonization as a strategy. Design for recycling. You heard some time back talking importance of design for recycling. That's the other pillar. And finally, we look at these are all not enough. You need to have partnership. So how do you develop business models along with technology to drive this entire recycling? So that's something what we are kind of looking at from the recycling pillars to ensure that we are in a responsible fashion addressing this.
Okay. So there are a lot of open ends coming from, especially on the business model side. I will come to that on the business model side. Now let's come to Harsh now. Harsh, you have been, I think Harsh is one of the very few what you call investors who are doing late stage climate tech, right? So today in India, in fact, a lot of conferences, we have more early stage climate tech investors than the startups, but very few what you call late stage.
More investors than startups.
In early stage. And but we didn't have too many of what you call late stage investors. Luckily, Harsh is there. His fund property is there. So Harsh, let's say you look at this stage, right? And the classical is a very asset heavy business because it will have plant everything else. So how does this fund like you evaluate this kind of businesses? What are challenges you see? What are opportunities you see? What are the things you will have to tell to Amit and Adibade in the room?
No, thanks. I think that is of case. We've always enjoyed conversation with you, and it's great to be here. So thanks for having us here. So incidentally, actually, before I get into your question, and it's maybe serendipity, we actually did a full work on plastic recycling industry in the country, and we just 2 weeks ago actually released a report. I mean, but that's more for our internal consumption. But it was very interesting to see that the sector is actually coming up quite nicely, and we see a lot of potential in the sector. Of course, at a headline level, a lot needs to be done for the country, but we always say more from an opportunity perspective that right now the market for plastic recycling in the country is just $4 billion when we are just recycling only single digits of plastic, and when our consumption is just only 1/3 of what the global average is. So, I mean, just from a proper, I mean, that's how we look at anything, right? I mean, how the market is going to behave, and that's the first thing which plastic recycling really, really takes off. That you basically are seeing something which will, at least the market will be 2.5x of what it is today by 2030. So that's a big tailwind, right? I mean, and that's the base case, right? So for us, that itself is a very good starting point, right? And then you basically drill down into what are the nuts and bolts and whether things make sense, right? So from a late stage investor perspective, what we definitely need to look for is what are the profitability metrics, right? Now, at least for the plastic recycling industry, there are some parallels, right, in the sense of metal recycling has taken off and has reached a certain stage where the sector is very investable, and I think plastic recycling is also getting there. Second thing, of course, is the whole EPR regulation has been there now for some time, and the regulatory barriers have been, in the sense, regulatory uncertainty is less. Let me put it that way. So that is also a very big comforting point for us. But I think what we would need to see is, the settlement on some of these technologies. How are the unit economics of these technologies kind of stacking up? And most importantly, are we able to get to the last end consumer, right? Right now the problem in the whole recycling industry is that the profit pools are mostly taken either by the aggregator, and then the recyclers are not able to be competitive because you are not actually at the end of the day talking to the end consumer. So I think those are some of the things at a very high level which we see changing, and that's where some of the integrated business models, as people are now forming, could become very attractive.
So I think quick question to Ashok. Probably the end user for this plastic will be you, right, Sabiq? So, right, Amit, who's your end consumer? Is end consumer driven by EPR, or is driven by labeling? Like say, people want to use what you call recycled plastic, or people like you who want to buy for your crackers?
So, so both, right? So for example, for me, I do collect plastic. I won't be collecting plastics, but there are agencies who collect plastics that they convert, like Amit, who converts into pyrolysis oil. That pyrolysis oil will be consumed by the crackers for us. And that, once it goes into the crackers, you go all the way through the, there is a mass balance approach and other, I won't say regulation, but framework that comes into existence. So how do you look at allocation part of it? And finally, you start looking at claiming the recycled contents present in your polymers. That's the way it's kind of goes. And not just crackers, as a matter of fact, it can even be extended to refineries. You can start looking at low carbon products, you can start looking at aviation fuel, which I mean, did touch upon.
Okay. Amit, your side, like say, who is your so Sabiq, or you also trying to go to a direct consumers like brands which are buying recycled plastic? Is that also a market for you right now, or?
No, so the way the value chain works is that there is going to be, in the complete value chain, after the plastic comes at its end of life, let's say it's at a landfill, if we can take the local example here in Delhi, there'll be certain waste management majors who are working in a public-private partnership with the government. And they would have, so to say, control, or they would have access to the waste flow. From that waste, now plastics would need to be first segregated. So there's a kind of a formal methodology of segregating the targeted kind of plastics. Plastics is of course an umbrella term, and there are HDP, LDP, polypropylene, and all of these different kinds. So you take your targeted plastics. In the case of chemical recycling, that would be polyolefins. Once you have them sorted and segregated at scale, you bring them to the chemical recycling unit, where essentially the longer chain hydrocarbons in these end of life plastics are essentially recovered through a process which can simply be thought as a liquefaction. So essentially from solid plastics, you're going to these liquid monomers. They look not very different from, let's say, a diesel or a naphtha. At which point of time, the boundary territory of this particular conversion plant or the recycling plant stops. And now you have, so to say, a feedstock. Just like crude is a feedstock, which goes to the oil and gas industry, here is a renewable, or what the industry likes to call it, a circular feedstock, because of its point of origination. And from there, it will go to a petrochemical, or it can go to an oil and gas industry, which will then reconstitute the molecules back to make new materials.
So that is the whole thing. So I think now I'll come to Ram. Ram comes from the philanthropy side, it's different. So probably Ram also give a minute intro before we start. But there's a different question, right? So I think Harsh mentioned very interesting statistics. He said we are at 1/3 of what the global plastic consumption is per capita. I think we are almost 1/10 what Norway consumes, right, per capita. So I think whenever people talk of there's too much plastic being used in India or this that, right? I think the problem is not the consumption side. The problem is more on the collection side, right? I think more the way it's being collected and disposed. That's the real challenge rather than the consumption. So, like, what is your view in the philanthropy side? Are they more worried about the collection side, which is upstream side, or what you call downstream side, which is technologies like chemical recycling? So, what is your take there?
Yeah, great question. First of all, thanks for having me here. My name is Ram and I am Director Impact Investing at AVPN. And AVPN is Asia's largest consortium and network of impact funders. So I come from a very funding perspective, both philanthropic and private capital investments. So to answer your question, Shailesh, I think philanthropic capital pretty much generally looks at the larger, more visible problems, which is at upstream. Whereas downstream requires patient capital, very long-term this thing, and then it's very highly fragmented, right? You have mechanical, you have chemical, and then you have biotech, and then you have emerging technologies, which the philanthropy capital is not at this point focused at. So the downstream is now reliant primarily on venture capital. Again, within the impact investing space, of all the impact investing in India, only 1% is towards plastic. 99% is towards other.
Okay.
It's a very minuscule amount even within impact investing. Um, so I think there's a large scope for philanthropic capital to start focusing on downstream solutions, and that can only happen when there are structures like blended finance facilities,
Okay.
where there is opportunity for multiple parties to come together. When that happens, that's when philanthropic capital is actually going to be interested
Okay,
in.
I got it. So you
Yeah.
talked about blended finance. Probably I'll go to Harsh now. Harsh, what do you think? That you, as an investor, looking for a blended finance kind of a facility, or you are immune to it? Second, do you really care about impact, or are you looking for venture returns? So very controversial points, but these two. Right?
So that's always has been a quandary for investing in anything related to climate, right? I mean, the moment you talk about impact, then you are basically sitting as a CSR expense, and you really can't scale things beyond the point, right? And so, at least as a fund, we have taken this philosophy that we are investing only in profitable commercial businesses, and that comes from a belief. When we started investing in renewable energy in 2008, exactly the same conversation we used to have around this renewable energy. And look at it today. I mean, it's amongst the biggest wealth creators in India and across the world. And that's a belief we have for many of these things. In fact, when we looked at the plastic recycling industry dynamics, we think it can also be a good wealth creator. So now, coming to the point that does this actually need blended finance? Maybe for some period of time it actually needs some amount of it to mitigate the kind of the initial perception of risk.
Oh,
right?
very nice
So
perception.
that is what one needs to really get to, is what I would say.
Yeah,
I mean, I agree with you. I think it's primarily what blended finance does is you have at least one or two catalytic funders who give that cushion of being able to provide some trust, right? So that more private owners of capital who see some amount of risk mitigation can jump in. But that's going to be the bulk of the capital.
okay, so to start. But so Harsh, do you think there will be unicorns coming in plastic recycling?
So I think I would not say unicorns as such, because unicorns is a word which has been significantly abused and misused. So, but I think the reality is that, let's face it, right? I mean, climate investing or climate businesses, let me put it that way, is a hard work, right? Now, the point is, would it create wealth? Definitely, it will create wealth, because at the end of the day, the world is moving
So
towards climate.
to rephrase, will you see a 1,000 crore revenue company?
1,000 crore, I mean, see, basically, if we just do the maths, right? We still just now talked about $10 billion market.
Correct.
In India.
Correct.
So which essentially 80,000 crores.
80,000
So
crores.
you could
Yeah, so
easily have
essentially is there. Yeah.
at least
Multiple
a couple of
1,000 crore
companies of
companies
1,000 crores, right? So that is easily doable. I think the challenge could be that whether you do get it in 5 years or does it take 10 years.
Yes, got it. So, Dr. Ashok, what do you think? Like, say, as a SABIC, as a company, do you think in your vertical there will be a 10,000 crore or 15, he said 80,000 crore market? What is your take on that?
Yeah.
Do you think that market size?
So let's step back a bit and look at it. Right now, first let me talk about SAVIC, like what we did in the chemical analysis, the chemical recycling part of it. Right, we have gone ahead and looked at establishing partners to kind of make pyrolysis within our boundaries itself, pyrolysis oil. We also offtake pyrolysis oil from other companies as such, including pulling out plastics from ocean, converting them into pyrolysis oil. So there's ocean plastics getting converted, at least for the demo level we have kind of established. So there's a lot of opportunities that are existing today as you continue to go about with it. In a country like India, which is feedstock deficit, where we are importing a lot of crude, huge opportunity for one to kind of convert these plastics into feedstock. Challenges are there in terms of how are you looking at the cost perspective part of it. But again, you can convert them into fuel. These fuel, you can convert them into crude. Crude goes into your polymers. You have fuel as a market that you are looking at. You are looking at sustainable fuels. Today, India is looking at putting methanol into your fuels in a way to kind of reduce your dependency upon the imports part of it. Same is the opportunity existing out here. So it goes much beyond plastics, I would say. Even today, if I go one step ahead, each of the country have their decarbonization targets. Each of the companies have their decarbonization targets. And in many of the decarbonization target, if I talk about scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 is outside your boundaries as such, the supply chain that you are getting. If you are getting low carbon products, that is going to prevent the amount of investment that you are doing because you are at a much fraction of a cost able to secure raw materials at a lower cost. Now, when it comes to chemical, using these technologies, if you are able to kind of get the carbon footprint down, connecting it to decarbonization, huge benefit. That's where I think the earlier speaker spoke about life cycle assessment, understanding the hotspots and driving it. So opportunities are huge, possibilities are huge. It is just understanding, connecting the dots, and taking advantage of this to take it to the next level.
So possibilities are huge, opportunities are huge, and you have to connect the dots. I think now I come to Amit, right? Harsh also mentioned about having 80,000 crore market, multiple thousand crore companies. Ashok talked about a feedstock. So I think the first problem I will address: how do you think the technology is ready? Your technology, what you're working on, to get the feedstock at the price competitive was, because that's a very critical part. Is those economics working out as what Harsh said? He's looking for those economics. So are you there? Well, what's the take? The industry, not you, basically on the industry. You think the industry is there right now at the inflection point?
So we'll have to speak. So this actually is a much more nuanced, and I think I would say, it'll have to be looked a little bit deeply across the value chain, the cost economics. So fundamentally, if you start post-consumer now, it's at a landfill site. So the first set of economics that we have to discuss, or it would have to make sense, is for the segregation side of things, right? Somebody will have to use automated, high throughput kind of systems to get your targeted polyolefins or the kind of plastics that you're looking out there. We, based on there is the pre-existing field of mechanical recycling knows how to do it. There is a bit of it that needs to be repurposed for the requirements of chemical recycling. Because, for example, in countries like India, or most of, I would say, even Southeast Asia and emerging economies of the world, the target feature for chemical recycling will be these single-use flexible films. So almost 80 to 90%, if somebody has had the misfortune of going to a landfill site, you would see in the plastics that are there, almost 80 to 90% is actually these flexible films, single-use plastics, the grocery bags and all of these materials. So, and you have to be able to extract it out at scale. So it cannot be done manually, so to say, because these are a few grams, 3 to 4, 5 grams of bag each. That's how much the bag weighs. You have to get out tonnages over there to get feedstock for your plant. So the first is the cost economics on the segregation side. The know-how exists. It may be a little bit new for India because it was we haven't seen that degree of automation in waste management, but can it be done? Absolutely. So from a technological know-how and an ability to do it at scale, that exists. And the cost economics, what seems to be more and more cementing in the markets is that to look at plastics not from post-industrial sources where they are already they have a certain economics to them or they have a certain cost to them, but rather to mine them from the landfill site itself. Okay, so you get lower grade material, but really that's really the part of the environmental challenge that chemical recycling is looking to solve, that it's stepping up to. It doesn't want to step on the toes of mechanical recycling and recycle something which was already possible to recycle. So it's not a different way of doing the same old thing. It's about doing something which was actually either too hard or maybe even impossible to do before. So just to give a sense to the room about the numbers, maybe it's about anything from 4 5 rupees to 6 to 8 rupees a kilogram is the cost on segregation. Okay? And from that standpoint, what we see is over a period of time is companies are going to move in which are just pure play into segregation. That's already happening in Europe. Europe is a couple of years ahead on this, so to say. And you have pure play companies which say that we are going to just prepare feedstock for chemical recycling. Now comes, so to say, the main engine, which is the conversion part of it, to which was your main question. So over there, essentially, as I said, this is a sector that it's finding its feet on the ground in terms of technology. First plants are coming up. We are in those early days to maybe where EV sector was in I would say 2016 to 2017,
Yeah.
18, right? So a lot of companies doing different kind of things, some coming to the market, some falling and tripping over themselves while trying to do so. Different approaches are being tried, and then something will sail through. Certainly, the proposition is so strong, and we put a man on the moon in '69. So it's hard to argue in 2025 that we won't be able to solve from a technological standpoint. I don't think anybody will make that. So, but we are bringing more resource, more attention, more collaboration to go and as a society, I think there's a growth of a conscientiousness and a consciousness. We need to go and solve this problem. The business as usual scenario. So over there, actually the economics is something that works very favorably. Okay. In fact, I would say the economics is the least part of the challenge to get chemical recycling going and running. If it works to how it to how it can actually deliver on a well-executed project, you're looking at EBITDAs which are higher than 50, 60, 70%. You're looking at rates of returns which will be more than north of 20 to 30% on your capital. Okay.
So yeah, sure.
And just wanted to add to what Amit is saying right now, coming back to the European situation. Europe landfill is not allowed, right? So now you are comparing what is happening with respect to chemical recycling with that of incineration. Today in Europe, many of the plastic goes for incineration for generating
Okay.
electricity. Now if you
Yeah.
compare the emission between energy recovery and
Understood.
that of plastic pyrolysis,
Of course.
you would look at plastic pyrolysis to be far lower than that of energy recovery. Now, if you start connecting that with the price of carbon, actually economics starts working in a very different angle part of it. Countries like India, where landfill is not banned, you really cannot compare those part of it.
We are like mountains.
So those becomes a challenge for us. So, but I know sooner or later these policies and countries are moving towards zero landfill eventually, right? And that's when it can actually make a lot more difference. So it's important to start connecting the decarbonization story if you're looking at economics.
All the points. So just to again on the what Harsh mentioned that 1,000 crore company is possible, but we don't know 4, 5, 10 years. So what is your take? When will we see a 1,000 crore company in chemical recycling?
Well,
5, 10,
I mean, globally, there are already many companies. Okay?
No, in India.
In India, most certainly. See, the thing is that these markets are really, from a technology standpoint, global, right? So, what we are seeing is that, as this whole vision is coming together, and it's becoming more and more real with every passing year, just like it has become for EVs now, and everything is in strike range. So, what is happening is that, given that if you have to connect end of life plastics to the point of origination, really the criticality, we understand segregation and we know how to be able to get plastics out, the know-how is pre-exists. The real technical know-how or the new innovations that are needing to come to the market at scale are technology companies. What we are seeing is that companies which are in some ways even building their first plants in for example, Europe or even in the US, they are running into those 10-digit numbers and so on, right? Because they are showing a pathway. So the real thing is the IP creation and the ability to go and solve and connect these 2 points. So to your question, in India, actually, it really doesn't matter where the plant is. The first plant could be in Indonesia or in Singapore or in Sri Lanka or in India or in Brussels, right? But if there is a proof of the concept in terms of a technological possibility, then
So I think now we should investment. I think there's we can see the possibilities there. So let us shift to the policy side, right? I think in India EPR is talked a lot, external producer responsibility, right? So Dr. Menon, what is your take? What do you think? Is the policy really helpful? Has helped companies like him or companies like you? What is your take?
I think this is one policy which is actually making a difference when it comes to recycling. Right? We heard in the morning, right? What we are talking about, 50% of whatever FMCG or the packaging company is putting, collect it and start ensuring that you have 30% recycled content when it comes to rigid. Flexible, it's relatively less. Definitely, that is now encouraging or bringing in more transparency in India when we look at recycling kind of a thing. Today, we heard that if you look at government portals, we talk about 3 million tons plastics being recycled. If you look at India, approximately, don't quote me on this, but approximately if 25 million tons of plastics demand, India has 14 million tons typically going to packaging. Now we all know that these 14 million tons would come in the same year into packaging. Out of which we don't have a clear cut because of the informal sector. We really don't have a clear understanding of how much is recycled and how much is getting wasted. Now with EPR, you are actually bringing a lot more transparency and you are helping this informal sector to become formal sector. And that's becoming, and if you look at the recycling in India is pretty high, the informal sector is playing a very critical role in this entire thing. So I think that policy is playing a very critical role. Areas where the policy can actually make a difference would be, for example, having more clarity around the chemical recycling. Right now, we don't consider chemical recycling as in the EPR credits part of it, right? So those are some of the things which we need to kind of look at. And globally, if I look at a lot of countries, don't yet consider, very few countries in or states in US are counting chemical recycling into the credit, right? And that's something will grow over a period of time, I believe, but that's something needs to be taken into consideration. But I think this is one particular rule that has come into play, which is positively impacting and bringing in transparency. It takes some time. There is some difficulty. It takes some time to kind of get there, but I'm sure. I think with time we will be kind of much more transparent.
So I think overall, very positive framework, little bit. So Ram, your take as a philanthropy or what you call donors, do you think the policy set push more is needed, building the whole upstream businesses? So what is your take on the EPR overall?
I think what EPR has done is flip the cost structure, right? Historically, the costs were borne by the recyclers. Now it's the producers. So it will eventually lead to some kind of carbon credits in the energy market. So plastic credits in the plastics market. And that will again let more investment go into downstream projects, right? I think that's where this has to go from a policy point of view. I think it's a very positive policy action from my point of view.
Got it. So any other policy issue you think you as think that as the donors or the thing they are expecting to happen, especially basically on the waste collection, what you call segregation side?
Say that again?
On the waste segregation, everything else, is there any other policy push you think are needed in India? Because I think the real challenge in India we are facing more of the segregation and collection, right?
Yeah. I mean, segregation side versus again the investment flow, right? It's skewed towards more upstream. So there has to be a very conscious shift in where investment is moving through. That's again I'll bring in the blended finance approach.
Correct.
That is where you need more blended finance structures to, at least in the initial stage, like you mentioned, you may not need it for an extended period of time, but initially to kickstart and have these investments get going, you need blended finance to play a very important role, in my opinion.
Correct. I got it. So, but yeah. So anyway, coming to Harsh. So on the, let's say he talks about the blend. Like I said, you said initially you want blended finance, but later on probably. So overall policy environment. Like say, do you think the policy is the right tailwind, or as an investor you don't look too much at the policy side, or you are very cognizant of the what you call policy challenges when you are investing in or evaluating the businesses related to majority of climate tech sectors?
So I think regulatory always remains a big risk, and one needs to be very mindful of it. And typically, one wants to minimize the regulatory risk, especially in the plastic recycling sector. There are good news and bad news, as always is the case. The good news is that the regulatory framework is not dependent on government's finances. So if you think about it, normally you would say, let's say in the EV sector, you were actually dependent on subsidy coming from government's coffer, and that's why a lot of challenges came in, right? Here, government is just a police wala, right? They are basically making sure that someone is paying to someone else. So at least from that perspective, it's a very good initiative. I think I don't know what's house view here, but there have been now recently court challenges on the EPR, right? Some of the consumer electronic companies have come up with these court cases. Where does it lead to? I think that's something we will be watching. Just as a thought, I think Amit mentioned in terms of how can we integrate this chemical produced oil into the normal oil supply chain. That will be a critical factor. I mean, we've already done it with ethanol, so maybe there are parallels to be drawn from there, and that could actually help ignite the sector.
Amit, your take on the policy framework, especially on EPR, and how is helping it? It has been helpful or challenging, or you are?
See, I think the general consensus I see is that India is off to a great start. Okay, the EPR framework that we have can be argued to be even more progressive than what, for example, the European Union is continuing to, for example, have brainstorm at this point of time. So for example, we have the recycled content in place, and it kicks in as of 2025-26. And that I think will really drive the 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 need and therefore the economic value on the recyclates, both which are coming from mechanical recycling, but also create the markets for chemical recycling. And then there are other things which, of course, there is quite some understanding which needs not maybe just tweaking, but a complete, you have to pull it up by the bootstraps. The EPR credits, while the EPR is trying to bring the polluter pays principle into vogue, but the EPR credits have really fallen through the floor, right? Because of many other challenges that have come in the Indian ecosystem. The government is quite aware, and actually they are very keen to see as to how everything could be brought back to the rails. And as with everything, you try, you pilot, you iterate. So we are onto the right path. Now, coming to, I think Ashok had already said that given that chemical recycling is a new field, a lot of policy making is really ahead of us at this point of time. Starting really from the acceptance, from a broadening of the definition to include chemical recycling as a method of recycling. But also the recyclates that are produced, while we did say that they are completely like virgin because you're reconstituting the molecule, the polymer molecule back. But this will need to be accepted by bodies like FSSAI, which will allow their use, for example, for packaging and high performance applications. So it's procedural but needs to be done, and it's quite vital.
And just adding to him again about it, right? So it also gives opportunity because if you look at by 2030, we are talking about 70% recycled content, let's say in rigid. That's a technology challenge today. Chemical recycling can fill it up immediately, but if that doesn't happen, then you need to do a lot of work to get to that 70% recycled content into that. Initial part may still be possible, but the curve is pretty steep, and even for flexible packaging, there's a lot of room for innovation in that area. But I think the chemical recycling is going to play a critical role in filling that gap if this succeeds.
So now we are almost coming to the end. So any the last comments anybody have you want to give? Otherwise,
I think I just wanted to maybe add an industry perspective, and also we are missing Mr. Thota from Resustainability.
correct.
So he was not able to make to the panel. But I think one of the strong lurches forward that is happening in the sector is now the participation of the industry, right? So the petrochemical majors, of course, had an interest from the standpoint of pyrolysis oil offtake and to make circular polymers. But what we are seeing is that you have to go build these plants, which requires the capital financing, it requires the operational capabilities, and it requires the technical know-how, right? And some of this may not be available to any one company. So it requires a multi-stakeholder combination of companies and organizations which bring that deep expertise to come together. And we are starting to see that happen in India. As of this year, actually early this year, uh, corporations like Resustainability, India's largest waste management company, and a company called Aarti Industries, they are in a large company in chemicals. So they've come together and formed a joint venture where they're looking to roll out multiple recycling centers on plastics, including mechanical recycling, where they're doing already some really good work, but taking it to the next level, and also stepping into chemical recycling. So it's great to see actually corporations step into this.
Any comments? So okay. So I think we are just now in the session. Thanks a lot for your patience. Really appreciate that. If anybody has any questions, probably. Yeah.
My question is about the significance and importance of chemical recycling, which is very good. We talked about green chemistry also in the past fairly well. The concern that I would like to highlight is that India reach or the chemical management system in our country is probably still at a nascent stage. How are the companies facilitating the government to ensure that the chemical management system is in place so that these initiatives are in the overall framework good for the chemical management process in our country? It's good to see the business angle. It's very good to see how it is going to be relevant in terms of those big companies emerging. But overall chemical management system, what is the contribution being made by the industry? and by the institutions? That's my first question. I'll come back to that later.
So I can speak from a SABIC point of view, right? So the chemical management system of SABIC is governed by our internal policies and internal processes. We actually export to across the globe everywhere, Europe, US, Japan, almost all the stringent regulations are being kind of taken care of as such. Now, when we look at exporting materials to India, automatically all these standards are straight away followed. So even though India may not have certain specific standards in place, our internal standards actually ensure that the highest of that regulatory standards, which is in Europe, Japan, are kind of applied at an Indian level. We also kind of share in industry consortiums and other our practices for the government and kind of give our the way whatever we practice our inputs for them to kind of take that in their policies to the next level. So these are just not the most of the multinational pretty much stick to this our own stringent standards. That's something we look at.
The linkage with the informal sector, which is the other side that we are talking about becoming organized structure, is something which international companies can facilitate in the chemical value chain.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Expectation is it being raised by the institution, by the government, from the companies, or it is entirely left for the government to make the chemical management system function? I mean, we normally have stakeholder consultations, we have joint initiatives for developing certain systems. It's been so many years since independence, and the chemical management system is still at a nascent stage. So this needs attention, right? So that's what is the expectation that maybe some of us may raise any time ahead also. When we are into chemical industry and we are making so much of plastic, we are even talking now of pyrolysis and bringing it back into polymer-based recovery and upcycling. So that's something which needs fair attention. And if it's been done in Europe and America, and why can't India do it faster? It is probably an equally important action that industry should facilitate. Right? That's the point.
So I think your concern is absolutely appreciated. This is such a nascent segment that almost all of this work is ahead of us, and it requires the good work of people like you to actually join hands, working with petrochemical majors, companies developing the technology, to work with the government. The government also, needs assistance and help with all of this. But if I can say, I think the intentionality here is to do things which meet the bar, on environmental compliance, and to do things. Only that's the only way in which you can create a sustainable sector and build something and really truly solving the problem, and not in solving a problem, creating some other problems. So very much with you on this. A lot of work is needed, and would solicit your help on the same.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, there's somebody.
Sensei Raj, founder Vision India 2032. The question is on two prongs. One, we are looking at the credit volatility, EPR credit volatility. I come from a trading background, so I understand the volatility as a bread and butter.